What you are about to hear should not be in this video. There are moments in history so deliberately buried, so meticulously erased from every official record, that speaking of them feels like committing a crime against the powerful. In the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, during the autumn of 1855, an entire community was systematically destroyed. Not by disease, not by war, not by any natural catastrophe, but by the calculated decisions of men in distant cities who saw human lives as obstacles to profit. The land swallowed the evidence, the rivers carried away what remained, and within a single generation, the survivors were so scattered and so terrified that no one dared whisper the truth. What I am about to reveal was reconstructed from fragments. Journals hidden in church basements, letters buried in family trunks for over a century, and the trembling testimonies of descendants who only learned what happened to their ancestors decades after the fact. You will hear names that were deliberately scrubbed from census records. You will learn about families who vanished without any official explanation. You will understand why certain valleys in these mountains remain abandoned to this day, why no one rebuilds there, why even the animals seem to avoid those hills. By the end of this story, you will know 3 things that powerful people never wanted you to know: the true reason behind the massacre, the identities of the men who ordered it, and the chilling method they used to ensure that no witness would ever speak. Stay until the very last moment of this video, because the final revelation is the one that will permanently change how you understand American history. The Appalachian Mountains in 1855 were a world unto themselves. They stretched like a dark, ancient spine across the eastern portion of the United States, separating the rapidly industrializing coastal cities from the wild, untamed interior. In these mountains, time seemed to move according to different rules. The people who inhabited the hollows and valleys had minimal contact with the outside world. They survived on small plots of rocky soil that yielded just enough to keep them alive. They hunted deer, wild turkey, and boar in forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. They kept to themselves in ways that the lowland Americans, with their newspapers and railroads and telegraphs, could never truly comprehend. The nearest town of any real significance was often a journey of 2 or 3 days by horse, through terrain so difficult that most families went years without making such a trip. These mountain people were born in the hollows. They lived their entire lives in the hollows, and they fully expected to die in the hollows, buried in small family cemeteries overlooking the creeks where they had played as children. This profound isolation was simultaneously their greatest protection and their most devastating vulnerability. It meant that when danger finally arrived, there would be no one to hear their desperate cries for help. And it meant that when they disappeared from the face of the earth, no one from the outside world would come looking for them. The community at the center of this tragedy was known locally as Wicker Hollow. It existed in a narrow valley that ran between 2 ridges so steep and so heavily forested that the sun only reached the valley floor for a few precious hours each day. It was not a town in any formal, legal sense. There was no appointed mayor, no elected council, no sheriff with a badge, no church with a whitewashed steeple. There were simply families, approximately 14 of them, scattered across the length of the valley, connected by footpaths and creek crossings and the invisible bonds of 3 generations of shared hardship. These families were descended from Scots-Irish settlers who had arrived in the region in the late 1700s, seeking cheap land and freedom, from the coastal authorities who taxed them and conscripted them, and generally made their lives miserable. In these remote mountains, they had found both. The soil was poor and rocky, but it could be worked with enough determination. The game was plentiful for those who knew how to hunt, and the mountains themselves formed a natural fortress that kept out anyone who did not belong. By 1855, the people of Wicker Hollow had developed their own distinct customs, their own unique dialect that outsiders found nearly incomprehensible, and their own methods of settling disputes without any interference from external authorities. They trusted no one from beyond the ridges, and as events would soon demonstrate, they had excellent reasons for this suspicion. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came in late September of that fateful year. A man named Josiah Carvel, who served as the closest thing the Hollow had to a recognized leader, noticed that strangers had been observed on the eastern ridge overlooking the valley. These were not hunters passing through in search of game. They carried no rifles, no steel traps, no supplies that would suggest a lengthy journey through the wilderness. They simply watched. They stood among the trees at the ridgeline, and they observed the hollow below with an intensity that made Josiah deeply uneasy. He sent his eldest son, a capable young man of 19 named Thomas, to investigate. But by the time Thomas reached the ridge, after a difficult climb, the strangers had vanished. All that remained were boot prints pressed into the soft mud and the faint, lingering smell of expensive tobacco smoke. Josiah told his neighbors to exercise caution, but counseled against panic. Strangers occasionally passed through these mountains on their way to settlements further west. It probably meant nothing of significance. But Josiah Carvel was wrong. Those strangers meant everything. They were the advance scouts of a catastrophe that would erase Wicker Hollow from the world. What the families of the Hollow could not possibly have known was that their ancestral land had recently become enormously valuable. Not for farming, which the rocky soil barely supported. Not for timber, which was plentiful but difficult to transport from such remote terrain. The value lay beneath the surface, in the ancient rocks that formed the foundation of the mountains. A geological survey conducted earlier that year by a team of experts from Philadelphia had identified significant deposits of high-quality iron ore in the hills surrounding Wicker Hollow. The survey had been secretly commissioned by a consortium of wealthy investors, men who had already made substantial fortunes in railroads and manufacturing and who now saw an unprecedented opportunity to expand their industrial empire into the Appalachian interior. Iron was the foundation of the new industrial age. It was used to make steel, and steel was used to make everything: railroad tracks, bridges, factory machinery, weapons. The demand seemed limitless, and the men who controlled the supply would become unimaginably wealthy. There was only one problem with this otherwise perfect opportunity. The land was occupied. The families of Wicker Hollow held no formal deeds, no legal titles that would be recognized by any court in the country. They had simply lived there, generation after generation, as their fathers and grandfathers had lived there before. Them operating under the reasonable assumption that continuous possession was sufficient proof of ownership. In the eyes of the law, however, they were nothing more than squatters, and squatters, according to the legal doctrines of the time, had no rights whatsoever. The man selected to resolve this inconvenient problem was named Cornelius Marsh. He was 43 years old, a former military officer who had distinguished himself during the Mexican-American War through a combination of tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. He had developed a reputation among certain circles as a man who could solve problems that could not be solved through conventional legal channels. The investors had hired him specifically because they understood that the families of Wicker Hollow would never voluntarily sell land they did not technically own. They would never willingly leave the only homes they had ever known. They did not even comprehend the abstract concept of mineral rights, the aegis legal fiction that allowed someone to own what lay beneath the surface of land that belonged to someone else. Marsh's assignment was straightforward: make the families understand that they needed to leave, or, if understanding proved impossible, make them disappear. He arrived in the region in early October with 12 men, all of them veterans of various military campaigns, all of them personally loyal to Marsh, and all of them willing to do whatever was necessary to complete the job. They established a camp on the eastern ridge, the same ridge where Josiah Carvel's son had discovered the mysterious boot prints, and they began to formulate their plan. The first family to vanish was the Brennans. They occupied a small cabin at the far southern end of the hollow, isolated even by the standards of that profoundly isolated place. The Brennan family consisted of 7 souls. The father, a quiet man named Patrick, who had a gift for woodworking. The mother, a woman named Catherine, who was known for her herbal remedies. Their 4 children, ranging in age from 3 to 14, and an elderly grandmother who had been confined to her bed for nearly 3 years due to failing health. On the night of October 14th, their cabin caught fire. By the time the other families in the hollow saw the orange glow reflected against the clouds and made their way through the darkness to offer assistance, there was nothing remaining but ashes and smouldering embers. No bodies were recovered from the ruins. No survivors emerged from the surrounding forest. The Brennan family had simply ceased to exist, as completely as if they had never lived at all. Josiah Carvel stood in the smoking ruins as dawn broke over the ridge, his eyes fixed on the charred remnants of a child's cradle, and in that moment he understood with terrible clarity. This was not an accident caused by an overturned lantern or a spark from the fireplace. This was a message. This was a declaration of war. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. What you are hearing is not entertainment designed to pass the time. It is a resurrection of voices that were deliberately silenced. A painstaking reconstruction of horrors that powerful men invested considerable resources to erase from history. If you believe that truth matters more than comfort, that the past deserves to be remembered even when remembering is painful, then you belong here. Subscribe now, because stories like this one are exactly what certain people have worked very hard to ensure you never hear. The days immediately following the Brennan fire were saturated with fear and paralyzing confusion. Josiah Carvel called an emergency meeting of all the families to be held at his cabin, which was the largest structure in the entire hollow. 14 families meant approximately 70 people, and the cabin could not possibly accommodate them all. Some crowded into the single room until there was barely space to breathe. Others stood in the doorway, craning their necks to see and hear. Still others gathered beneath the windows outside, listening through the gaps between the rough-hewn wooden planks. Josiah stood before them and shared what he suspected. He told them about the strangers who had been observed on the ridge. He told them about the boot prints and the tobacco smoke. He told them that someone, for reasons he could not yet fathom, wanted the people of Wicker Hollow gone from this land. But he could not tell them who these enemies were. He could not tell them why they had been targeted, and he could not tell them what they should do to protect themselves. The Hollow possessed no weapons beyond the hunting rifles that every family owned for putting food on the table. There were no fortifications, no defensive structures of any kind. There was no way to send a message to the outside world requesting assistance. The nearest settlement that might conceivably offer help was more than 30 miles distant, across terrain so rugged that the journey would require days of difficult travel. And even if someone managed to reach that settlement, who would listen? Who would care about the troubles of a handful of poor mountain families with no legal deeds and no political connections? Some of the men, their faces hard with anger and fear, advocated for immediate armed resistance. They proposed ambushes along the mountain trails, traps set in the forest, a guerrilla campaign against the strangers on the ridge. Others, perhaps wiser or perhaps simply more frightened, argued for immediate flight. They wanted to pack whatever possessions could be carried and abandon the hollow before more families suffered the fate of the Brennans. The women and children contributed little to the debate, but their pale, drawn faces communicated volumes. They were utterly terrified. They had lived their entire lives secure in the belief that the mountains would protect them from the dangers of the outside world. Now they understood with sickening clarity that the mountains were not a sanctuary but a prison, and the walls of that prison were closing in around them. Josiah listened patiently to every voice, carefully considered every argument, and then made a decision that would haunt him until his final breath. He told them to stay. He told them that fleeing would mean abandoning everything their ancestors had struggled to build over 3 generations. He told them that they would face this threat together as a united community, and that Providence would surely protect those who stood firm in defense of their homes. He was catastrophically wrong about every single element of that assessment. Cornelius Marsh had studied military strategy and tactics under some of the most accomplished officers in the entire country. He understood, with the cold clarity of a professional, that the key to victory in any conflict was not the application of overwhelming force, but the systematic destruction of the enemy's will to resist. The destruction of the Brennan cabin had been a carefully calibrated probe, a test designed to reveal how the community would react when confronted with unexpected violence. The results had exceeded his most optimistic projections. The families of Wicker Hollow had not fled in panic, which would have solved his problem immediately. But neither had they organized any coherent resistance. They had gathered together, talked endlessly, and ultimately decided to wait and hope that the danger would somehow pass. This response told Marsh everything he needed to know about his adversaries. They would remain in place until it was far too late to escape. They would cling to hope until hope was no longer possible. And then, when hope finally died, they would break completely. The second attack came on October 19th, 5 days after the Brennan fire. This time, Marsh targeted the Carvel family directly. Not the entire family, not yet, but the eldest son, Thomas, the same young man who had climbed to the eastern ridge to investigate the mysterious strangers. The same young man who might have seen something, might have noticed some detail that could identify Marsh and his men. Thomas was returning alone from a hunting trip in the northern reaches of the hollow when he was intercepted on a narrow mountain trail. His body was discovered 2 days later at the bottom of a steep ravine, with injuries entirely consistent with a long fall from a great height. There were no witnesses to what had happened. There was no physical evidence that would suggest foul play to any investigating authority. But every single family in Wicker Hollow understood the truth instantly and completely. Thomas Carvel had not fallen. Thomas Carvel had been pushed. Thomas Carvel had been murdered in cold deliberation. And his father's overwhelming grief would soon transform into something far more dangerous than mere sorrow. Josiah Carvel buried his firstborn son on a hillside that overlooked the creek where Thomas had learned to fish as a small boy. He stood motionless over the fresh grave for hours, saying nothing, his weathered face seemingly carved from granite. The other men of the hollow came to offer their condolences, but Josiah barely acknowledged their presence. When he finally walked back down the hill to his cabin as darkness fell, he was fundamentally altered. The cautious, measured leader who had counseled patience and faith was gone, vanished as completely as if he too had died. In his place stood a father who had buried his child, a man who now possessed nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. He gathered the men of the hollow that very night and informed them that the time for waiting had ended. They would not sit passively and allow themselves to be picked off one by one like animals. They would find the strangers on the ridge. They would make them answer for what they had done. They would fight until they achieved victory, or until every last one of them lay dead. The men agreed without hesitation. They had no other viable option remaining. What none of them could have known, what none of them could possibly have suspected, was that Cornelius Marsh was counting on precisely this reaction. The trap had been set with exquisite care, and the men of Wicker Hollow were about to walk directly into it. The raid on the eastern ridge commenced in the dark hours before dawn on October 22nd. 15 men from the Hollow, armed with hunting rifles and axes and hatchets and the desperate, reckless courage of the condemned, climbed through the forest toward the camp where the strangers had been observed. They moved with practiced silence, employing skills that had been refined and passed down through generations of hunters who knew these mountains intimately. They reached the ridgeline just as the first pale light began to appear on the eastern horizon, fully expecting to find their enemies sleeping, vulnerable, completely unprepared for the violence that was about to descend upon them. Instead, they found an empty clearing. The camp had been abandoned. The fire pits contained only cold, dead ashes. The tents and equipment had been removed without leaving any trace. The strangers had vanished as thoroughly as if they had never existed at all. Josiah Carville stood in the center of that empty clearing, confusion slowly replacing the rage that had driven him up the mountain. And then he heard the first rifle shot shatter the morning stillness. The men from Wicker Hollow had walked directly into an ambush of lethal precision. Cornelius Marsh had anticipated the raid days in advance. He had deliberately allowed his men to be seen, had practically sent an engraved invitation for exactly this attack. He and his soldiers had positioned themselves in the trees surrounding the clearing, invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, their rifles already aimed at the spots where their targets would inevitably stand. When the shooting began, it continued for less than 3 minutes. The sound of gunfire echoed off the surrounding ridges, a terrible thunder that could be heard throughout the valley below. 11 of the 15 men from Wicker Hollow died in that clearing before they could fire a single shot in return. 3 others sustained wounds so catastrophic that they would not survive the agonizing journey back to their homes. Only 1 man escaped the ambush without physical injury, Josiah Carville himself. He ran blindly through the forest in a state of profound psychological shock, his clothing drenched with evidence of the carnage, his mind fracturing and splintering under the unbearable weight of what he had witnessed. By the time he stumbled back into the hollow, the sun had fully risen on a community that had lost its defenders, its fathers, its sons. The women and children and elderly who remained were now completely and utterly defenseless against whatever horror came next. Leave a comment below with whatever words or thoughts emerge in your mind after hearing this. Do not censor yourself. Do not worry about being polished or appropriate. Some stories demand a raw, unfiltered response. Tell me what you are feeling in this moment. What transpired over the following days is the portion of this history that was most thoroughly and deliberately erased. The survivors of Wicker Hollow, approximately 55 souls consisting primarily of women, young children, and elderly individuals too frail to have participated in the doomed raid, were presented with a choice by Cornelius Marsh. He rode into the hollow on the morning of October 23rd, accompanied by his full complement of armed men, and he delivered his ultimatum with the calm, businesslike demeanor of a man conducting a routine commercial transaction. The survivors could leave immediately that very day, taking nothing with them except the clothes they were currently wearing. They would walk out of these mountains and never return. They would never speak of what had happened here to anyone, under any circumstances, for as long as they lived. If they accepted these terms, they would be permitted to survive. If they refused, if they hesitated, if they showed any sign of resistance whatsoever, they would share the fate of their husbands and fathers and brothers, and no one would ever know what had become of any of them. It was not genuinely a choice. It was simply the illusion of agency offered to people who had already lost everything. Within 48 hours, Wicker Hollow was completely empty of human habitation. The cabins that had sheltered 3 generations of families were systematically burned to their foundations. The crops in the small fields were trampled and destroyed. The livestock was slaughtered or scattered into the forest. The family burial plots, containing the remains of grandparents and great-grandparents going back to the original settlers, were left unmarked and untended. The families themselves scattered in every direction, some heading west toward territories where they knew no one, others disappearing deeper into the mountain wilderness, a desperate few attempting to make their way to distant relatives in states where no one would think to ask uncomfortable questions. They carried with them a terrible secret that they were absolutely forbidden to share, a memory of horror and loss that would haunt their descendants for generations to come. And they carried something else as well, a fear so profound, so deeply embedded in their souls, that most of them would never speak of Wicker Hollow again, not even to their own children, not even on their deathbeds. The land was cleared. The investors in Philadelphia were entirely satisfied with the outcome. The iron ore beneath those mountains was extracted systematically over the following decades, generating wealth beyond anything the original settlers could have imagined. The consortium that had financed the operation became one of the most powerful business entities in the entire nation. Its members counted among the elite of American society. Cornelius Marsh received a substantial payment for his services and retired to a comfortable estate in Virginia, where he lived in peaceful prosperity until his death from natural causes in 1871. He never faced any legal consequences for his actions. He was never questioned by any authority. He never lost a single night of sleep over the lives he had destroyed. The families of Wicker Hollow, meanwhile, received nothing. No compensation for their stolen land. No acknowledgement of what had been done to them. No justice of any kind. Their names were never recorded in any official history of the region. The massacre, if that word can even be applied to something that officially never occurred, was simply and completely forgotten. Except that forgetting was not quite as thorough as the perpetrators had intended. Josiah Carvel survived for another 23 years after the destruction of his community. He never remarried after the death of his wife Mary, who succumbed to illness in 1863, her body weakened by years of hardship and grief. He never fathered more children to replace the son he had buried on that hillside. He lived out his remaining years in a small, dilapidated cabin in eastern Kentucky, working as a farmhand for wages that barely kept him alive, drinking far more whiskey than was good for his health, and writing letters that he knew no one would read during his lifetime. Those letters, composed in the cramped, careful handwriting of a man with limited formal education, told the complete story of what had happened in Wicker Hollow. They named names. They described events in precise, unflinching detail. They pleaded with future generations to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that the dead were not consigned to eternal oblivion. The letters were discovered in 1878, nearly a decade after Josiah's death, by a distant cousin named William Carvel, who was sorting through the old man's meager possessions. William was horrified by what he read. He was also absolutely terrified. The consortium that had financed the massacre had grown even more powerful in the intervening years. Its leading members had become titans of industry, their influence extending into the highest levels of government. Exposing them, even decades after the fact, would almost certainly bring swift and devastating retaliation against anyone foolish enough to try. William Carvel was a young man with a family of his own to protect. He made a decision that he would struggle with for the remainder of his life. He hid the letters in a locked trunk. He told no one what he had discovered, and he carried the secret to his grave in 1912, tormented by guilt but unable to summon the courage to act. The letters remained hidden, silent witnesses to a truth that refused to die. The documents resurfaced in 1947 when William Carville's grandson, a man named Robert, discovered them while cleaning out old family storage in preparation for a move to a new home. By that time, more than 90 years had passed since the events described. The original perpetrators were long deceased, their bones mouldering in elaborate family crypts. Robert Carville was a high school history teacher with a deep appreciation for primary sources and a stubborn commitment to historical accuracy. He immediately recognized the extraordinary significance of what his grandfather had hidden away for so long. He devoted the next decade of his life to painstaking research, cross-referencing every claim in Josiah's letters against available historical records. He found corroborating evidence in land transfer documents that showed the Hollows territory being sold to mining interests mere months after the families disappeared. He found oblique references in old newspaper archives to unrest in the Appalachian interior during the autumn of 1855. Most remarkably, he discovered the personal papers of one of the original investors, papers that had been donated to a historical society by descendants who had never bothered to read them carefully. Those papers included detailed financial records of the entire operation, including payments made to a military contractor identified only as C. Marsh. The massacre had happened exactly as Josiah had described it. The cover-up had worked precisely as intended, and for almost a century, the truth had remained buried. Robert Carville spent years writing a comprehensive book about his findings. He documented everything with meticulous care, anticipating the skepticism that would inevitably greet such explosive claims. He submitted his completed manuscript to 17 different publishers. Every single one rejected it. Some editors claimed the subject matter was too obscure, too regional, unlikely to attract a broad readership. Others suggested that the evidence, while intriguing, was insufficient to support such serious accusations against historically prominent families. A few were considerably more direct in their refusals. They explained, with varying degrees of diplomatic language, that certain powerful interests would not appreciate having their ancestors publicly identified as participants in mass atrocity. Robert Carville died in 1962, his health broken by years of frustration and disappointment. His book was never published. His research materials were boxed up and stored in his daughter's basement, where they gathered dust for another 4 decades. It was not until 2003 that a graduate student at a small university in West Virginia stumbled upon references to the Wicker Hollow incident while researching 19th-century land disputes in Appalachia. Intrigued by the fragmentary mentions she had found, she began searching for additional documentation. Her investigation eventually led her to Robert Carville's surviving daughter, now an elderly woman living in a nursing home in Ohio. The daughter remembered her father's obsessive research, remembered the boxes of papers that had been stored away after his death. She gave the graduate student permission to examine everything. The resulting academic paper, published in a respected but specialized historical journal, finally brought the massacre to scholarly attention. The paper was read by a few hundred academics, received modest coverage in regional historical publications, and generated a brief flurry of interest among genealogists researching Appalachian family histories. And then it was largely forgotten again, buried beneath the endless deluge of new information that characterizes our contemporary age. Just another obscure historical footnote, lost in the vastness of the digital archive. The valley where Wicker Hollow once stood still exists. It remains almost entirely empty of permanent human habitation. The stone foundations of the original cabins can still be located if you know precisely where to look, hidden beneath more than a century and a half of accumulated undergrowth and fallen leaves. The hillside where Thomas Carvel was buried is now part of a state forest, the grave itself unmarked and unvisited, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. The descendants of the families who fled that October are scattered across the entire country, most of them completely unaware of their connection to this historical tragedy. They do not know that their great-great-grandmothers walked through those mountains carrying nothing but grief and terror. They do not know that their ancestors were systematically erased from historical memory by men who valued mineral deposits more than human existence. They have lived their entire lives in ignorance of where they truly came from and what was done to their people. Perhaps some of them are listening to this story right now, hearing for the first time the truth about their own heritage. The question that haunts anyone who learns this history is not merely how such an atrocity could have happened, but why it was permitted to vanish so completely from collective memory. The answer is simultaneously simple and profoundly disturbing. The massacre was forgotten because forgetting served the interests of everyone who possessed the power to shape historical narratives. The investors who profited enormously from the land had obvious reasons to avoid publicizing how they had obtained it. The government officials who had looked the other way, who had perhaps received compensation for their willful blindness, had compelling reasons to maintain their silence. The newspapers that might have investigated and reported the story had practical reasons to avoid antagonizing wealthy and influential potential advertisers. And the survivors, themselves traumatized and terrorized and scattered across an indifferent continent, had overwhelming personal reasons to avoid reliving their nightmare, especially when speaking out might bring further retribution upon themselves and their children. Silence was the path of least resistance for everyone involved. Silence was the strategy most likely to ensure survival. And so silence hardened into the official historical record, generation after generation, until the events themselves seemed to disappear entirely. Cornelius Marsh left behind his own documentation, though he certainly never intended for it to be examined by anyone outside his immediate circle of associates. His personal papers, donated decades after his death to a regional historical society by a descendant who never bothered to review their contents, include a detailed operational account of the Wicker Hollow assignment. He describes the entire campaign in coldly clinical terminology, as if he were composing an after-action report for a legitimate military engagement rather than documenting the systematic destruction of a civilian community. He notes with evident satisfaction the efficiency of his men. He analyzes the effectiveness of the psychological tactics employed to destabilize the target population. He expresses professional pride in the outcome achieved. At no point in his account does he acknowledge the fundamental humanity of his victims. At no point does he express any doubt about the morality of his actions, any regret for the lives extinguished, any recognition that the people he destroyed were human beings with families and hopes and inherent worth. Reading Marsh's account is a deeply disturbing experience. It forces the reader to confront what philosophers have termed the banality of evil, the unsettling ease with which ordinary human beings can convince themselves that extraordinary cruelty is not merely justified, but admirable. Cornelius Marsh was not a monster in any conventional or dramatic sense. He had a wife whom he apparently loved. He had children whom he educated and provided for. He attended church services regularly and contributed to charitable organizations. He was respected and admired within his community as a man of accomplishment and integrity. And yet he planned and executed the destruction of more than 50 innocent people without experiencing any apparent moral difficulty whatsoever. This is perhaps the most crucial lesson embedded in the Wicker Hollow Massacre. Genuine evil rarely announces itself with theatrical villainy. More often, it wears respectable clothing, speaks in measured and reasonable tones, maintains impeccable social credentials, and files its paperwork punctually. The survivors of the Hollow carried their psychological wounds in different ways throughout their remaining years. Some became profoundly withdrawn, refusing to discuss their past even with their closest family members, burying the memories so deeply that they seemed to forget consciously what they could never truly escape. Others became obsessive in their need to testify, telling the story repeatedly to anyone who would listen, desperate to ensure that at least someone would remember what had been done. A few turned to religious faith, finding some measure of comfort in the belief that divine justice would eventually be served, that the perpetrators would face accountability in the next world, if not in this one. And a small handful dedicated themselves to documentation, spending years compiling records and testimonies, preserving evidence against the day when someone might finally be willing to listen. These survivors and their determined descendants are the reason we possess any knowledge of Wicker Hollow today. Without their stubborn persistence, the massacre would have achieved the complete erasure its architects intended. One of the most emotionally powerful documents to emerge from the aftermath is a letter composed by Mary Carville, Josiah's wife, addressed to her sister in Pennsylvania. The letter bears a date of November 1855, less than 1 month after the family was forced to flee everything they had known. In trembling, grief-stricken prose, Mary describes the loss of her son Thomas and the annihilation of the only community she had ever belonged to. She writes about the nightmares that assault her every time she closes her eyes, visions of fire and violence from which she wakes, screaming. She writes about the crushing guilt she experiences for having survived when so many others perished. She writes about her consuming fear that no one will ever believe what happened, that the truth will be interred alongside the victims, that the world will simply continue as if Wicker Hollow had never existed. The letter concludes with a plea that resonates across the intervening centuries. Remember us. Please, I beg you, do not allow them to erase us from existence. We were here. We lived and loved and struggled. We mattered. We mattered. Mary Carville died in 1863 during the chaotic violence of the Civil War that was then consuming the nation. She never returned to Appalachia, never again set foot in the mountains that had been her home. She never witnessed any form of justice for her murdered son or her destroyed neighbors. But her letter survived. It was passed carefully from one generation to the next within her family, preserved with reverence, occasionally read aloud at family gatherings, rarely discussed in any depth. Today, it resides in a private collection, accessible only to researchers who are aware of its existence and can demonstrate legitimate scholarly purpose. For most of the past 170 years, Mary's desperate plea went entirely unanswered. The families of Wicker Hollow were forgotten exactly as their destroyers had intended. They were erased from history. They ceased to matter to anyone beyond their own scattered descendants. But perhaps, finally, that long silence is beginning to break. The events at Wicker Hollow did not occur in isolation. They represented one early instance of a pattern of violence against Appalachian communities that would continue for decades. Driven by the same economic imperatives and the same fundamental contempt for human life that had motivated Cornelius Marsh and his employers. The labor conflicts of the early 20th century, the systematic exploitation of coal, mining communities, the environmental devastation that continues to scar the region to the present day, all of it connects through a direct historical line to the attitudes and assumptions that made Wicker Hollow possible. The foundational belief was simple and brutal. The people who inhabited these mountains were expendable. Their lives, their communities, their connections to the land that had sustained their families for generations, all of it could be legitimately sacrificed when it stood in the way of profit for distant investors. Wicker Hollow was among the earliest and most extreme manifestations of this ideology. It was very far from being the last. Understanding this historical pattern is uncomfortable. It requires acknowledging that American progress and prosperity have frequently been constructed upon foundations of violence and dispossession. It means examining critically the celebratory narratives we have inherited about national development, recognizing the suffering that those narratives conveniently omit. It demands that we sit with moral complexity rather than retreating into simplistic stories of heroes and villains. This is genuinely difficult intellectual and emotional work, but it is absolutely necessary work, because until we honestly confront how atrocities like Wicker Hollow occurred, until we understand the systems and incentives that enabled them, we cannot develop the awareness needed to prevent similar injustices in our own time. The mountains of Appalachia possess an undeniable haunting beauty. The ancient ridges roll toward the horizon like frozen ocean waves, their colors shifting through shades of blue and green and purple as the light changes throughout the day. The forests are dense with oak and hickory and pine, alive with birdsong in spring and brilliant with color in autumn. The streams run clear and cold through valleys that seem unchanged since the beginning of time. But beauty can serve as a mask. These mountains have witnessed things that should never have happened. They have absorbed the tears and the suffering of countless generations. They have watched in silence as communities were systematically destroyed, as families were forcibly scattered, as crimes were committed and then meticulously concealed. The beauty of Appalachia is genuine and profound. So is its darkness. To truly understand these mountains requires embracing both dimensions, acknowledging the full complexity of what this land has seen. The last known survivor who had been present during the destruction of Wicker Hollow was a woman named Sarah Brennan. She had been a young girl of 8 years when her family's cabin was burned, when she was pulled from sleep by her mother and forced to run through the darkness as flames consumed everything she knew. Sarah lived until 1937, reaching the remarkable age of 90. In her final years, she agreed to be interviewed by a local historian who was attempting to document oral traditions of the region. Those interviews, preserved on fragile audio recordings that have since been carefully digitized, constitute some of the most valuable primary source material we possess for understanding the human reality of what occurred. Sarah's voice on those recordings is thin and wavering with advanced age, but her memories remain vivid with the terrible clarity that trauma imprints upon the mind. She describes the world of her childhood in loving detail, the smell of wood smoke drifting across the hollow on autumn mornings, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the creek, the taste of wild blackberries picked warm from hillside brambles. She speaks of the night the strangers came, of the orange glow of fire against the sky, of her mother's hand gripping hers so tightly that bruises remained for weeks. She describes the long, desperate walk through mountain terrain, carrying nothing, eating nothing, stopping only when exhaustion made further movement impossible. She recounts the years of grinding poverty that followed, the succession of temporary shelters and menial jobs, the constant fear that the men who had destroyed her community would somehow find her again. She speaks of nightmares that persisted throughout her entire life, 8 decades of disturbed sleep, haunted by faces of people she had loved and lost. And she expresses, in words that tremble with emotion even across the gulf of years, her hope that someday the truth would be spoken aloud, that someday someone would remember. Sarah Brennan's hope has finally been fulfilled, at least partially. Her story is being told now, her testimony is being heard. The names of the dead are being spoken again, after generations of enforced silence. This may not constitute justice in any complete or satisfying sense. Justice would require accountability, would require consequences for the perpetrators. And all of those men passed beyond the reach of earthly judgment long ago. But recognition matters. Acknowledgement matters. The simple act of declaring that this happened, that it was wrong, that the victims deserved better, carries genuine moral weight. It pushes back against the erasure that was supposed to last forever. It honors the memory of people who were treated as if they were worthless. If you have remained present until this moment, it is because you comprehend something essential about the nature of history and memory. You understand that the past is not a closed book, safely contained and separate from our present concerns. It is a living force that continues to shape our world in ways we often fail to recognize. You understand that silence is never truly neutral, that the decision not to speak about injustice is itself a form of complicity with that injustice. You understand that bearing witness to painful truths requires a kind of courage, a willingness to confront realities that would be easier to ignore. And you understand that every act of remembrance, every time a suppressed story is finally told, constitutes a small but genuine victory over the forces of forgetting. If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly follows these stories. Your presence matters, your attention matters, your willingness to engage with difficult history, to sit with discomfort rather than clicking away to something more pleasant, matters more than you might realize. In a culture that constantly encourages distraction and superficiality, choosing to learn about something like Wicker Hollow represents a meaningful act of moral seriousness. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one require extensive research, careful verification, and a deep commitment to historical truth that is increasingly difficult to find. If you believe that buried histories deserve excavation, that silenced voices deserve amplification, that the comfortable amnesia of the present should not be permitted to erase the suffering of the past, then you belong in this community. Subscribe now. Press the like button so that this video can reach others who need to hear what you have heard. Share it with someone who would understand its importance. The mountains remain, the hollow remains empty. Wind still moves through the trees in that valley, stirring branches where children once climbed and played. Somewhere beneath the accumulated soil of 17 decades, there may still exist traces of the lives that were lived there, fragments waiting to be discovered by some future generation with better tools and greater determination. The story of Wicker Hollow does not end with the departure of its last survivor. It continues every time someone speaks the names of the dead. It continues every time someone refuses to accept the official silence. It continues every time someone chooses to remember. Mary Carvel begged us not to forget. Sarah Brennan hoped that someone would eventually tell the truth. Josiah Carvel spent his final years documenting everything he could recall, driven by the desperate need to ensure that his suffering and the suffering of his community would not simply vanish into meaningless oblivion. Their voices reach across a century and a half of silence, asking only that we listen. We owe them that much at minimum. We owe them so much more than that. But listening is where the work of justice must begin. And now, at last, you have listened. The question that remains is what you will do with what you have heard.